Thomas, when I look up at the sky, I see planes that don't flap their wings. When I look down into the oceans, well, we can see submarines that don't have fins. To fly and to swim, we haven't modeled nature, but it seems to get stronger, more general AI. We seem to want to model the brain. Talk me through the logic there and whether or not that's working as a concept at the moment.
When you talk about flight and people who try and develop flight, it does make me think about some of the earliest pioneers of flight. And initially, there's lots of people who tried to come up with ways that did mimic the flapping wings of nature. There's one in particular, a guy called Franz Reichelt, who tragically was killed jumping off the Eiffel Tower in his sort of flapping bird device that he'd built. The question that you're getting at here reminds me of this parable about a sort of primitive civilization that's trying to get to the moon, and they're building hot air balloons because that's the only way they know how to get into the sky. And they build successively bigger and bigger hot air balloons and conclude, since each hot air balloon is going higher and higher, eventually all it will take is for them to make a hot air balloon to go to the moon. So it's a question of whether you really have the ability to know in advance which line of pursuit of technology is going to get you towards your final goal. Now, if your final goal is to create something intelligent, I think the issue that we have is almost that we don't have a really rigorous definition of what general intelligence is. If you have a computer with a programming language, you can program it to do all sorts of different tasks. So if your definition of intelligence is a single device that's capable of performing multiple tasks, then a computer with sufficient software is intelligent by itself. But we don't really think of it that way. We have other sort of ideas about what intelligence might entail. Perhaps a general intelligence would sort of need to be conscious, self-aware. It would need to be able to learn, adapt itself. And I think the reason people look to the brain is because the only evidence we have of anything intelligent, that any sort of intelligence that manifests itself, is only from nature and only from the brain. One of the first ideas from AI came from this Dartmouth conference in the 1950s, when there was a group of scientists. They met up over a summer, and they decided that if they could program a computer to do the things that a human was able to do, then they would obviously have made a very big advance, and this could advance them in all sorts of different fields. And initially, they sort of tried to teach a computer as you would teach a child, by showing it lots and lots of different concepts, defining lots and lots of different words, many, many different ideas, and then, of course, all of the rules that linked these symbolic concepts together. And this was what was called, and I think is now still called, good old-fashioned AI. So it's this idea that you can get intelligence, you can hard code intelligence, just by introducing tens of thousands of concepts, like a huge dictionary, define all the rules that link them together, so that the thing will know fire plus water equals steam, smoke, extinguished fire, all that sort of thing. And of course, the reason this didn't work was that it was just prohibitively difficult to program all of that in there in the first place. And so you've had more recently the two sort of major attempts to get to useful algorithms that can perform tasks. You have evolutionary AI, where people have algorithms that essentially have certain behaviors that are allowed to vary, as in evolution, through sort of mutations. And then at the end of each generation of these algorithms being produced, they will be compared to some sort of fitness function, which will determine, how well the algorithm is doing at its task. And all of the unsuccessful algorithms will be killed. So you're implementing a sort of natural selection that does mimic nature in that sense. And then you have the neural networks. Now, the neural networks are sort of somewhat inspired by how we believe that the brain works, but they're not actually detailed modeling of the brain. Instead, you have a setup where you have lots and lots of different statistical connections between different nodes in this network. And as you train the network on data, some of the connections are reinforced and some of the other connections are lapsed. They have lower weights on them. And this is what allows the neural network to map from inputs to certain kinds of output. And we don't know necessarily whether this is how the brain actually works in practice, because in the brain we know that lots of what's important about cognition doesn't just involve neurons, but other parts of the biological brain as well. But it is our sort of conceptual idea about how learning happens in humans. Now, when it comes to how quickly we can get towards general AI, there's this conception that, okay, the only way that we know will work is by mimicking the intelligence that we've seen. There might be some other way of getting there, but we don't necessarily know that it will work. And the question then comes, in what level of detail do you have to simulate a brain to actually manifest a more general intelligence? And this is where I think your question comes in, because at present we're an awfully long way off developing an intelligence of that kind. There's a project at the moment called Open Worm, which is aiming to simulate the brain of the nematode worm, which is probably the simplest brain that we have mapped in detail. It's, if I remember rightly, a few hundred neurons compared to the billions in the human brain. And even simulating this in a sufficient level of detail to get something that might behave like a nematode worm purely from simulating its brain is a challenge that's at the edge of what computer science can do at the moment. And so when you imagine the additional layers of complexity that would come in simulating more complex animals or humans, you can see that simulating the brain, although it is a path that we suspect would eventually probably be successful, is an awfully long way off. And there's still an awful lot of disagreement about what level you would need to simulate it in to actually capture the basic features of human cognition and human consciousness.
If you and I were to design a computer program for fun, just let's say a game that simulated a worm in a garden in its environment, it feels to me that we wouldn't have to put too much computer programming in to fool many people that this was behaving much like a worm. I think about what a worm does. Yet it sounds to me like you're saying the brain of that worm is still relatively complex compared to computation that we have or other things that we know and can map around us. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, that's right. And I think it's interesting that you say it's much, much easier to mimic the behavior than it is to mimic what actually leads to that behavior. I think that's very true. And I think what's really telling for me about AI and the sort of hype around the field at the moment is so it's sort of tangential, but there's an interesting guy from Leeds called Steve Verzik, who you may know about, who's developed this chatbot called Mitsuku.
I know Steve, yes.
Mitsuku is essentially a chatbot that he has programmed in his basement or in his office for the last 10 or 20 years by manually hand typing all of the possible responses to the questions that people will ask his chatbot. And this is essentially a sort of good old-fashioned AI approach to the problem of passing the Turing test. He defines an artificial intelligence in the sort of way that you would manually input every possible symbolic answer to every possible symbolic question that people would ask of it, and it can then resemble something intelligent. But Steve is very honest about his chatbot. He says, there's nothing actually intelligent here. It's all just things that I've written. It's essentially, in some ways, a glorified dictionary with extremely complicated rules. And yet, the responses that Steve gets so often for his chatbot are people who believe that his AI is somehow sentient or conscious, even though they can see its limitations for themselves when they talk to it. And this goes way back to the very, very first natural language processing systems. There was a programming system called ELIZA, which was developed in the 1960s, I believe. And this essentially mimicked a Rogerian psychotherapist. So whenever you told it something about your life, it would say things like, tell me more, or how does X make you feel, and so on. It was essentially just rephrasing the things that you had told it back at you. And what happened when this was actually used on people was a lot of them seemed to think that the therapist did actually understand them and was more conscious than it was. So I think in this whole area, we need to be very careful to remember that mimicking a behavior is much easier than mimicking the complex consciousness that goes into that behavior. And also that we have a tendency to anthropomorphize things. We have a sort of innate idea that things are either not alive or alive. And if anything starts betraying some of the traits of being alive, then we're sort of subconsciously shifting it into that category. And I think this is why things like ELIZA and things like Mitsuku, which ultimately are fancy code, but code, can be mistaken for people by something more than they are.
I put it to Steve recently that if people were falling in love with his chatbot, Mitsuku, they were in a sense falling in love with him. Because as you say, it is just lines of his code, lines of his English language that he's chosen to use, and I'm sure he cross-references them, of course. You talked about anthropomorphism, which is interesting, and people anthropomorphize teddy bears and they anthropomorphize the universe. And we certainly have a huge tendency to do this. And one thing I put to the European Robotics League recently is why is there a tendency to put eyes on robots? It's not necessary, and it's leading us down a path to what I can only assume is they want to create humanoid or human-like robots in the future. Could you tell us a bit more where this comes from, this tendency to see things as human that aren't?
I think in some ways it's just to do with our. Perhaps it's something cultural, perhaps it's something evolutionary, but it sort of makes sense that there's not really much space in our cognition, in our way of relating to the world, for understanding things that are governed by rules of mathematics, for example, rather than being sort of conscious animals or humans that we interact with. I think anthropomorphizing things helps us because we can use the sort of set of ways we have of understanding each other and the ways we have of understanding humans to then relate to this new entity. I mean, when it comes to Steve Verzik and Mitsuku, I think that the genius that he has is he reads all of the conversations that people have with his bot. And this means that he has essentially become an expert in the human psychology that applies to the very specific niche situation of people talking to a chatbot. He knows the kind of things that people will say to Mitsuku, and it allows him to come up with responses that are the best at making the user think that they're talking to something sentient, something interesting to talk to. Now, this is just a manual process for him where he's doing this every evening in his office. But one of the interesting developments that I think has maybe passed us by a little bit in the West is Microsoft have this chatbot called Showice. And Showice follows the sort of neural network approach to chatbots. So I should say in advance, the reason we're talking about Mitsuku is that Mitsuku is the chatbot that is closest to passing the Turing test. They have a competition every year called the Loebner Prize, which gives you the robot that is most human-like in conversation. But this Showice robot, which is predominantly in Asia, in Mandarin and Japanese and Korean at the moment, is a neural network approach. So it doesn't rely on hand-scripted responses. Instead, it is using the neural net approach of being trained on huge amounts of conversational data. And fundamentally, the architecture of this chatbot, Showice, is that it tailors its responses to keep people engaged, to keep them talking to the bot for as long as possible. And it's actually attempting to maximize the number of response turns in the conversation that people have with it. And I think in some ways you can sort of see how such a bot, and I've seen a conference where the guy from Microsoft came and talked about Showice, and they were very proud of the fact that there was one user who talked to this thing for 24 hours in a row, and had thousands of responses back and forth and was talking to it more than any of their friends and so on. And I think if you're in a situation where there's an incredibly complex algorithm that is being allowed to train itself on lots and lots of user data, lots and lots of conversations, and told to maximize your engagement and maximize your commitment, then you have all of that plus your innate tendency to anthropomorphize things that aren't human, because that's sort of how you know to deal with things. It's understandable why people might view these systems as more complicated or more sentient than they actually are.
Yes, and so when I think about that, you're saying that Steve is able to predict behaviors just like you and I could predict the behavior of the proverbial worm that we talked about. He's not predicting the decision-making process to get to that. He's merely responding to the output.
No.
Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
And of course, there's huge amounts of things going on in our brains and in the brains of animals that we don't even appreciate are going on the whole time. I mean, if you sort of imagine your own thought process, you might be thinking that it's a sort of endless stream of text going on in your mind or something like that. But where this comes from, how this is generated originally, the sort of complex ways in which it interacts with your surroundings, and of course all of the stuff that's going on purely to keep you alive in terms of homeostasis, digesting food, regulating your body temperature, all this kind of thing. It's all complexity that is contained in this one organ, such that you could mimic the behavior of it simply by, in the same way as you can video someone and then watch the video over and over again. You can sort of see the behavior, but it's a surface level of a much deeper phenomenon.
You talked about natural selection earlier, and then sort of artificial natural selection. Natural selection, that makes me think of Darwin and survival of the most adaptive, and the way that sort of genetic mutations can cause beneficial results in terms of access to food or mates, or able to avoid predators and so on. That always struck me as a survival opportunity. The way that you described artificial natural selection sounded more like you were talking about progress or innovation. Is that different?
Well, I think the genetic algorithms that people come up with is basically just trying to say, okay, well, we know of only one process in the universe that has ever produced intelligence, and that's natural selection. And natural selection can sort of force things into various biological niches. You think about all the sort of symbiotic creatures we have. It wouldn't really make sense if you were designing a creature from scratch to say, well, this will depend on some other creature to survive. But if it turns out to be a successful strategy, then the sort of optimizer of natural selection will find all of the possible successful strategies, and eventually, given enough time, you will see all of them manifest themselves. So I think the interesting thing here is, although this is much slower because many of the algorithms that you're producing, as indeed many of the mutations that are produced in natural selection, are useless and therefore not the kind of thing that we would intentionally or consciously look to produce, it can also allow you to find counterintuitive solutions. So one of the ways that these algorithms are often used or deployed is in the context of playing computer games, because a computer game is a brilliantly structured environment. There's always a very obvious goal, normally to finish the level or to get as many points as you can, this kind of thing. And if you set an evolutionary algorithm playing one of these basic computer games, sort of randomly mutating the buttons that it will press and so forth, what they eventually do is they cheat. They find the flaws in the code. They find the ways to break the game. They'll find some bug that will give them an infinite score or an unbelievably high score. And it's a counterintuitive solution that no one would set forth and design to begin with, but that can be found if you sort of iterate through this very, very large space of possible evolutions. So when it comes to a sort of innovation landscape, generally when people innovate, I think they usually have an idea of how their system is going to work when they're designing it. They're not just sort of randomly stabbing about in the dark, although sometimes it can seem like that. But so I think there are differences in the approaches to evolution from the sort of natural selection point of view, where you say, okay, well, we're just going to define this one function to optimize, and that's can you survive and pass on your genes and reproduce. And in the case of a evolutionary algorithm, this will be how successful is the algorithm at performing a task, and then it weans away all the ones that are unsuccessful, versus a sort of a more human-driven design and evolution process. And I think some of the interesting approaches to AI are where people are saying, well, could we try and combine the two approaches? Because we know that if you just let raw evolution try to come up with intelligence, well, it took billions of years on Earth. It could take far, far longer and require far, far more hardware and far more iterations between software to take place in the context of a computer. So if you have a designer who's also looking over the evolving algorithms and picking out the ones that it thinks are the most promising, could you maybe accelerate this process? I mean, to me, it's not clear that we know what all of the waypoints on the way to a fully evolved intelligence are, in the same way as we don't necessarily know what all of the waypoints on the way from the first light-sensitive chemicals on a bacteria all the way forth to the human eye. It's kind of difficult to see what those waypoints are in advance. But it's a process that might be faster and might accelerate development. But I think, again, you have to be careful to say that any of this stuff is around the corner, because it's easy to make predictions that say 10 years, 20 years, 30 years we'll have an algorithm like this. But what's much, much more difficult is saying, okay, if you're giving me a prediction of that kind, I want to see your roadmap. If you're saying we'll have general intelligence in 50 years, what will we have in 25 years? What will we have in 10 years? What will we have in 5 years? It's like you almost want a business plan for this sort of thing to be outlined. And if you don't have that and you don't know what the waypoints are on the way, then it's very difficult for you to say that you can be confident in that final prediction. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, because this thing isn't going to be switched on overnight. And as you say, what would be the roadmap? What would be the stations up the mountain that would be indications that you were making progress towards that goal? If we fitted out every single car on the planet right now with autonomous driving capabilities and LiDAR and cameras and so on, I think it's fair to say that tomorrow would be a challenging day on the roads, including
Yes.
carnage and death. I think we can agree on that. But what would a week or a month or a year look like if we just insisted on keeping things going so that these algorithms could learn at mass scale? I mean, would we have autonomous vehicles in 30 days if we did that?
I don't think so. Um, Mostly because I'm not always convinced by. So the current thinking in machine learning is that the more data you have, the better, and this is certainly true, and it's being demonstrated in things like OpenAI's GPT-2, which is this new text generating device, this new text generating algorithm, which can produce stuff that I will admit I thought 5, 10 years ago we would never see a neural network producing for decades and decades. Um, but it can, and there don't seem to be too many developments beyond raw data acquisition and processing. So, in that sense, you might think if you had your system where you had lots and lots of self driving cars driving around and trying not to hit each other, they would all learn incredibly rapidly. But with a self driving car, there's also hardware limitations, uh, the quality of the data that you're getting through, and complex aspects to do with the decision making of the car. I think people would be reluctant to see them deployed. I mean, I'm sure you saw the news story recently where a jaywalker in New York was hit and killed by an autonomous vehicle purely because when they had. So, how do they tell it not to hit pedestrians? Well, they feed it thousands and thousands of images of pedestrians crossing a pedestrian crossing and say, this is a terrible idea. This is when you should brake, slow down to a stop, and not hit the pedestrian. But they hadn't trained it on any images of jaywalkers because they just hadn't thought of that as something that could happen. And it just goes to show that there can be things that people can overlook in the fundamental architecture behind how these machines work that can lead them to be flawed. And so if you did have this massive sudden rollout, I'm sure, as you say, the first week afterwards, we'd find an awful lot of those. Um, Beyond that, I think you'd have to talk to some of the machine vision people specifically about the problems that they see with autonomous vehicles. One of the ones that does concern me is the idea that a lot of these machine vision algorithms can be fooled through spoofing, through essentially you can create images that will trick the algorithm into thinking that it's looking at something other than it is. And this isn't so much a case of someone dressing up as a piece of tarmac so that it thinks that it's driving over the road. No, you can do it just with a few pixels different here and there, because the way that these algorithms perceive images is very different to how humans perceive images. There was a good study that showed a good example of this actually. If you were being told to identify polar bears versus say ducks or cows or any other species, you would probably do just as good a job if the bear was in full color or in silhouette. You'd be able to identify the silhouette of the bear just as easily as you could identify the full color photo of the bear. That's not true for machine learning algorithms because the way that they identify images is based on how does each pixel relate to each adjacent pixel. We probably identify things more based on their outline, which is why you can still sort of navigate in your room when it's dark and shadowy. But these machine learning algorithms can judge things based on how each pixel relates to each other pixel, which means that if you put something in a silhouette, suddenly it can't recognize it anymore if all it's ever been trained on is full color photos. So, in a similar way, how do you know that your training data set, even if you think that it's very good for this autonomous vehicle, is going to generalize to every individual situation? But I think it's important to say that actually, in some ways, the algorithms can be better. So, if you scramble up the polar bear image such that you sort of like one of those toy puzzles you get where an image is scrambled and you have to rearrange it, if you divided it into 20 squares and rearranged them all randomly, the algorithm would still be great at recognizing that as a polar bear, even when a human might struggle, because actually the relationships between these adjacent pixels, which is what it's really looking at, haven't changed all that much just because you've scrambled a few of them around. So it's interesting to know, and I think this is important when it comes to looking at how these narrow AI algorithms are doing things. It's important to have a sense of their psychology, so that you can understand in advance, so to speak, how they will fail and how you can stop them from failing.
Yes, great example there that we'd still be able to recognize the polar bear, but I see your point that doesn't necessarily help you to avoid a polar bear on the road.
No.
That's a different sort of challenge. The phrase necessity is the mother of all invention is coming to mind as you speak of all this. And it's difficult sometimes to see what the necessity is when we look at all these developments around AI. And that's not just AI. We look at other technologies like blockchain, and sometimes people say, well, blockchain is a solution looking for a problem. So what necessity do you see that's being solved by artificial intelligence right now in 2019?
So when we talk about artificial intelligence, I think we've already been sort of making this distinction, but I think it's very important to recall that there's two types, really. There's the strong general AI that people hypothesize about and we speculate about. We speculated about how you might develop it earlier in the show. And then there's these narrow machine learning algorithms. Now, when it comes to these machine learning algorithms, the necessity that they're solving is how on earth can you possibly process all of the data that we're all generating all of the time? This simply can't be done by hand anymore. The recommendation algorithms for something like Netflix, something like YouTube, something like Amazon, the algorithms that service adverts, the algorithms that determine what you see on the internet, there's no way that any human could ever process all of the data that's being taken in there. And ultimately, it's this desire to leverage these streams of data into solving problems better that is why people are developing these machine learning algorithms. So is it a necessity? Well, it depends what you mean by necessity, doesn't it? In some ways, you're saying, if we have all of these streams of data and there's a perception that they can be converted into understanding of human behavior, even in the case of a recommendation algorithm, manipulation of human behavior, then that in turn can be converted into profit. And if necessity is not necessarily the mother of invention, then profit certainly tends to be a pretty good one as well.
Yeah, that's a good comeback, actually, that profit also drives innovation. Of course it does. We're taking a few risks, though, aren't we? Whether we're driven by necessity or whether we're driven by profit. I spoke to Stuart Armstrong recently, someone I know that you know, and he doesn't see AI as an existential threat to humanity. And I think you have to draw a clear line between what's a threat to humanity in terms of wiping out all human footprint with fairly immediate effect, and one that almost wipes out all human footprint but allows the population to rebuild itself. And they are slightly different things, although both fairly devastating. But he doesn't see AI as one that could wipe us out. We talked about evolution earlier, and I was going to ask you whether you thought whether neuromorphic implants were a form of natural selection of the future. And also, while you answer that, if you can tell me whether you think that extension of AI is evolution, and if it is it the evolution of machines or the evolution of human beings?
Wow, so we're touching on an awful lot of topics here. Okay, I'll try and deal with all of these points. So natural selection, insofar as it applies to humans in the Darwinian sense, is sort of over. We're in a situation now where people who would naturally probably have died can be kept alive by medical science, by a sort of caring, tolerant society. There are still evolutionary pressures on individuals, but it's also clear that the developments that we're capable of making over the course of a sort of short, of an extremely short time, are now far outstripping the natural evolution of the human species. So there's this idea that, we'll take charge of our evolution. I think that's already happened. Think how long it would have taken us to naturally evolve an immunity to something like smallpox. Well, we've wiped it out. There are some people now who naturally have an immunity to things like HIV, but we have developed the drugs and the technology that can enable people to live with that condition for an awfully long time. And of course, we've developed ways to prevent people from contracting it in the first place. So you can sort of view medical science and these technologies as already, in a sense, accelerating human evolution. And people will talk about, we think of all sorts of fancy ways that we could make ourselves smarter or make ourselves physically better. You've talked about neuromorphic implants as an example. I mean, when it comes to a lot of people, simply doing things like correcting the iodine deficiency that a lot of people still have, particularly in the developing world, would make us as a species on average smarter. So I think we have already taken some level of not control, but well, it's in the same way that with climate change and CO2 emissions, we're sort of controlling the climate, just not in a direction that we necessarily know anything about. I think with medical science, of course, we are generally trying to keep people alive for as long as possible. So we are sort of controlling our evolution in a positive direction. In the long term, I think that's certainly, if technology continues to develop in the way it will, there's just no question that this will be the way that the human species evolves. No question at all. I mean, the pace of change of technology is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times faster than natural selection. And so whether any of these technologies manifest themselves in 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years doesn't really matter, because all of that will be faster than natural evolution. And, there's this idea that, okay, you have a neuromorphic implant that makes you more intelligent. Well, true, but you also have a smartphone on which you can look up almost anything in the world of human knowledge, although, you might spend it on Twitter instead or looking at YouTube cat videos or something. But technically, this is a piece of technology that has made you much smarter. And yet we don't necessarily think of it as humans being augmented or controlling their evolution in any way, even though it very much is. So I think maybe the borderline between biological enhancements and technology like a smartphone that we view as being very external to who we are is going to blur in coming decades. But it's kind of a continuation of a process that's been going on since the invention of writing, really.
The difference between a nanosecond, something that we could achieve with technology or perhaps with quantum technology, the difference between a nanosecond and a second is the same proportionally as the difference between a second and 31 years. So I agree with everything you're saying, but the speed that neuromorphic implants could provide, the speed of which AI might operate, is fathoms times faster than we've maybe seen in the past. What kind of risks does that present, or what kind of risks do you see from AI in general as we go down this path of discovery?
So when it comes to risks from AI, I think you really need to divide them up into the speculative risks that come from general AI and the risks from narrow AI and machine learning that are present in the world around us all the time. So to talk about the risks from a hypothetical general AI first, bearing in mind that my personal opinion is that I don't think we'll see anything like this for a long time, but assume that it's possible to simulate a human brain. Well, then, yes, as you say, there's this idea that you could run it on much, much faster hardware, and therefore, even if all you've done is create something as complex as the human brain, which is already an incredible achievement, then perhaps you could speed up the input-output of the human brain such that this thing is running at 1,000 times speed, 1,000,000 times speed, in which case this individual brain would have 1,000,000 years to come up with things that would take humans ordinarily a year. At which point you can sort of see, okay, well, if you have lots of these things running in parallel, then they will be more intelligent than us, and they might learn how to improve themselves to become even more intelligent. In fact, they certainly would. In which case, then you can see a situation where there are general artificial intelligences that are far smarter than the human race. And the reason that people see this as a risk, in my view, is a pretty sound one. If you're an ant, you can't really infer why a human is destroying your anthill. You just have no ability to understand things on their level. They can behave in very unpredictable ways that you wouldn't ever be able to comprehend. So this is why I think this is quite philosophical speculation, because when people imagine these general intelligences, They're imagining something with extraordinary capability. So people will talk about, how do you make an AI safe? How do you program it with a goal that's compatible with the goals of humanity? I mean, to me, that question in the philosophical realm that these people ask it is almost the same as saying, what would you tell God to do? Because that's the level of difference of capability that people see for this hypothetical general intelligence. So at this point, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of scenarios you could concoct that would be damaging for humanity. Perhaps such a thing, such an entity would decide that it didn't need us. We have no reason to believe that it would be constrained by anything that we had told it to do necessarily. If it's capable of modifying itself, maybe it just says, I'm not interested in that instruction anymore. I'm going to go and do something else that doesn't involve you at all. Or perhaps we do give it an instruction, but we don't specify it correctly. So it's interesting. I had a discussion with someone about this once, and I was talking about this idea of you develop a general AI and you want to give it some programming that will ensure that it doesn't harm the human race. What do you program it with? And the guy I was talking to said, utilitarianism, obviously. And I thought to myself, well, that's not obvious at all. Utilitarianism is this sort of philosophy that you do whatever causes the maximum good for the maximum number of people. Okay, well, what's the maximum good? What's good? It varies from person to person. It's not well defined. It's very difficult to define that in terms of a single mathematical function. If you do try and define it in terms of a single mathematical function, you'll miss out on all kinds of subtleties. I mean, I quite like having a nice chicken meal from Nando's, I also quite enjoy having loving and caring family members. So if you're trying to define all good things in the form of a mathematical function, then you have to say that everything is fungible, everything can be traded with everything else. So can I say that 1,000,000 meals at Nando's is the same as having a family that love me? It's bizarre. And yet this is the sort of reductionist philosophy that is the best approach to human morality that we could put into such a general AI system. So you can imagine all of these scenarios where we tell the AI to make everyone happy, and it decides that happiness is endorphins flowing through a brain, and it just injects us all with some sort of heroin, or indeed kills us all and then replaces us with circuitry that is just experiencing a simulated endorphin flow forever and ever and ever, and it decides that it has maximized human happiness in this way. I mean, these are all scenarios that you can sort of imagine, but I think the point of it and the risk of such a thing being developed, if it did ever exist, is we simply don't know what would happen. That's why people call it the singularity. The singularity in physics terms is the heart of a black hole. No light can escape from it. There's no way that you can see what's going on there. And I think this idea of a hypothetical general AI is very similar, because we have no idea how it would interpret any goal that we gave it, or indeed if it would stick to any goal that we gave it in advance, which I think is why it is a legitimate concern, but the important thing is to be realistic and reasonable in your assessment of where these technologies are. So I think in 1,000 years, in 10,000 years, if technology continues to develop at this incredible pace, maybe this is the kind of thing that we need to be worried about. But coming back to the other point I was making, which is that there are risks from the narrow machine learning algorithms that we have today, I think these can be underappreciated in the discussion of AI safety. And it basically comes down to the fact that our ability to kind of regulate new technologies lags behind the development of the technology pretty much always. And so there's no rules at the moment against deploying an algorithm in an irresponsible way. So here's an example. These machine learning algorithms that people make nowadays that are trained on all this data are so complex that even the people who make them and run them don't know what they're doing half the time. So take YouTube's algorithm. This is the one that recommends you videos. It recommends you videos based on what it thinks that you will be most likely to spend the most time watching, which means that these networks of videos get set up which are related in the sense that people who liked this also watched lots and lots of that, and so forth. And the more time you spend watching one of these recommended videos, the stronger that weight is in the neural network that's doing these recommendations. But the issue then is that a lot of people use YouTube for extremist content, and they tend to be the people who spend the most time on it, watching video after video after video. And so the weights that lead you from a sort of normal, politically kind of neutral video towards another normal, interesting, politically neutral video are weaker than the ones that lead you from something politically neutral to something politically radical. They've had issues on YouTube where people have discovered rings of paedophiles who are watching, what is essentially softcore child pornography. And because these are the people who watch video after video after video, the links between these videos are extremely strong. So once you've started watching one, the algorithm will serve up dozens more. These people are sort of networking in the comments underneath the YouTube algorithm. Obviously, the people at YouTube never intended to set up this kind of ring on their website, but through deploying the algorithm on a complex system without sufficient care, it's led to these unintended consequences. And I think lots of these narrow AIs, the ones that we have to worry about fairness and bias in them, are going to be deployed. They're still being deployed now, and they'll have lots and lots of unintended consequences purely because of how complex the system is. And we're sort of at the mercy of the people who run them at the moment, because there's just not sufficient regulation in place to say, okay, if your algorithm has these results and these impacts, then you can't use it anymore. The only thing that comes close is the GDPR regulation, which just came in recently in the EU, which does say that you have a right not to be subject to a decision that has been purely made by an algorithm. But even this is very difficult to enforce, and I think there's lots of cases at the moment where people are being subject to decisions that come from machine learning algorithms, and these decisions can't really be explained, and if they're erroneous or unfair, then there's not too much recourse to challenge them. So that's the sort of near-term problem that I see from machine learning technologies for the human race. But I did a podcast a while ago and wrote an article that was based on a report called Malicious Uses of AI. So if you look me up and see malicious uses of AI, there'll be some other examples there as well. One of the things that people are worried about, for example, is automated hacking, where you have, well, essentially hacking that's done by algorithms rather than people who can, the algorithms can sort of test thousands and thousands of different lines of code in a defense network for flaws, and they can do it much quicker than people. So in this sort of thing, you end up with an arms race between the algorithms that fight the algorithms and the algorithms that hack the other algorithms and all this sort of thing. So this is the other sort of thing that could cause near-term disruption.
Yes, and in summary there, you've talked about two key things. You've talked about the fact that these narrow AIs are impressively working away in areas like recruitment and the judiciary system to make decisions that affect lives, and that is fairly profound in itself. And as we cast our minds back, 140 years ago, not that long, and certainly not that long on the human timeline of probably 10,000 years now of modern brains and 200,000 years of kind of looking like a relatively modern human. 140 years ago, we're on horseback. So to think what the next 5, 10, 140 years looks ahead of us is near impossible. So I guess that's where the mind could wander. And I think it's also negatively enhanced. I mean, we all love the movies and we love sci-fi, but we just saw that new Terminator movie Dark Fate come out, and in it is this incredible humanoid robot that can almost withstand anything with its purpose of wiping out a human being's life, which is a bit of a daft concept, really, because I'd have thought a drone with some basic facial recognition, computer vision, computer software on board of it, and a laser could do that job much more simply and quickly. But then I guess that would be a rather short movie if that was the case. How does the risk compare of continuing to develop these AIs that will make decisions on human outcomes? How does the risk compare to, say, 1945, when we were thinking about whether to, well, before that, develop the atomic bomb, and in 1945, whether we dropped it on certain cities around the world? Is that a comparison that we can even refer to?
So in some ways, we're in a better situation than we were at the dawn of the atomic age. And in other ways, we're in a far worse situation. So let me try and explain what I mean by that. For me, 1945, the development of the atomic bomb, was a huge moment in human history, purely because at this point the stakes were very, very real. We now had devices that had the capacity to, if not wipe out the human race, then kill at the touch of a button millions of people, which is not something that humans had ever had before. There was no way that we could have personally ever severely threatened the continuation of our own species and the continuation of most other species on Earth. But now that technology had been liberated and put into the hands of humans for the first time. And there's all sorts of stories about how people thought this would go. The scientists at the time, for example, they had there's an apocryphal story, and it probably is true, about the scientists having a bet about whether or not the device, when detonated, would cause runaway nuclear fusion reactions in the atmosphere. I mean, I don't think any of them took it seriously. I think the odds on the bet were pretty good. It's always a good idea to have a bet if you can, where if you lose, the world ends, and therefore you don't have to pay out on the bet. It's always very helpful. But even though this was considered unlikely, the fact that it was considered a possibility showed that the scientists at the time knew that what they were developing had the capacity to massively alter the face of the planet and, well, destroy an awful lot of life on Earth, potentially. And so what you see in the political activities of the scientists at the time is a tendency towards something that Einstein was involved with, a sort of philosophy that was called one world or none, which was this idea that people would have to work together, governments would have to work together to prevent there being any sort of large-scale nuclear war. Now, obviously, when you look at the Cold War, you can say things were pretty tense at a number of points, particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's lots of famous incidents from history, and I talk about some of them in my podcast, nuclear near misses, where all kinds of insanely dangerous things were going on. There was the particular case of Stanislav Petrov that a lot of people know about, where he was on an early warning system versus the Americans. He was a colonel. The early warning system said that Russia was being bombarded with several different missiles. He didn't report it because he thought that the Americans only sending 6 missiles was a bit strange if you want to win the Cold War. So the theory was you'd need to send hundreds of thousands and try and destroy every city in the opposing territory. So he didn't report that, and it turned out to be a false alarm. So he's one of several people who has a claim to have saved the world as we know it, if not the whole of the human race in some ways. Although you can always dispute about how many people would die in a global thermonuclear war. I think in some ways it becomes a bit academic. It's not something that you want to happen. So the difference that we have nowadays is that the technological developments that are arising they have the potential to be deployed by much smaller groups of people, and that is dangerous. It's extremely difficult for a small group of people to themselves build an atomic bomb or an atomic arsenal of bombs. We know this because there have been terrorist organizations throughout the years who have tried to get their hands on them and failed. There was a cult in Japan called Aum Shinrikyo, which you may have heard of. They were responsible for the Tokyo subway sarin gas attacks in 1995, and they tried to source all kinds of deadly weapons alongside biological weapons, chemical weapons that they eventually used in this sarin gas attack. They also tried to source a nuclear bomb from the Russians, but they couldn't get it. And this was a cult that was very well funded. There were lots of millionaires involved in it. There were lots of smart people. They attracted scientists to their cause, and their aim was essentially to wipe out the human race. They wanted to destroy most of the world so that they could it's what we call the sort of millenarian philosophy they had, where they thought if we destroy the world, then something brilliant can take its place, and this will be, at the hands of our supreme leader. Aum Shinrikyo didn't manage to do that. But nowadays we have new kinds of technology, and they're developing faster and faster, very difficult to regulate. One example is with CRISPR gene editing. So there's a famous experiment that was conducted 5 or 6 years ago where the researchers demonstrated that with CRISPR gene editing kit, with stuff that was available to any lab in the country, any sort of reasonably decent scientists, these people weren't even experts in what they were doing. I think they were physicists rather than biologists, but they, were fairly smart, and they had about $100,000 of funding for this lab equipment. And they were able to resurrect the extinct horsepox virus, which is a close cousin of the smallpox virus. Smallpox, which we talked about being wiped out before, is currently kept as a biological weapon by the governments of the US and Russia. But essentially, what this has shown is that all it would take now is for someone to have access to the smallpox genome, $100,000 of funding, and a few decent scientists, and they would be able to develop this very dangerous biological weapon. And you can imagine that things like nanotechnology and other forms of gene editing are going to put the power to create large-scale destruction in a much, much larger number of hands. And this means that the coordination problem that the scientists after 1945 had to try and solve, where they were attempting to prevent world governments from blowing each other up and destroying humanity, this could become a much more difficult problem if the technologies allow smaller groups of people and even individuals to have more power over the physical world, in a sense, than they had before. And so in some ways I think it's better because we got through the nuclear crisis, although there's still nuclear weapons primed and ready to fly at any moment, and people we might not necessarily trust with their fingers on the buttons. But it demonstrated that there are ways that we can avoid destroying ourselves, but I think they rely on a level of wisdom and cooperation that we haven't yet developed.
Do you think that wisdom is coming, or do you think that wisdom will only come as we see things from a different perspective, and perhaps from a machine perspective rather than a human perspective? The question is, does it take machines to teach humans real morality?
That's an interesting one. I mean, I can sort of see the argument, but at the same time, I'm very reluctant to put, for example, machines in charge of something like nuclear weapons. There's been talk about how machine learning might affect the prospects for nuclear war, and you could sort of see how it might, in the sense that maybe if a machine learning algorithm was more intelligent than a human, it would find some way of executing a nuclear war without unacceptable risks to your own civilians. This was what kept us alive, really, during the Cold War. Was not actually any heady ideals of morality or cooperation or anything like that. It's just that neither side wanted to take the necessary risk. I think if you're imagining a scenario like the one I outlined, where new disruptive technologies show up, which can be used by a very, very great number of people, then it's extremely difficult to see how this wisdom is going to diffuse itself into all of those people, because it would only take a small group. It would only take one. It would only take a few thousand. It would only take a small disaffected group of people to enact something like this. And if you are in that situation, then it's extremely difficult to see what you could do about it. Even if, I mean, we are seeing overall that society is becoming more peaceful, but there are still groups of people who would quite gladly sort of take and use this kind of violent power against the powers that be, if they could, if they were able to. And I don't really see that going away anytime soon. And I don't know whether anything can necessarily stop it, which is why I hope that our best hope lies in, one, the idea that these technologies will be very difficult to develop, two, that we can come up with decent countermeasures in time, and three, that we can regulate the development of new technologies to make sure that if this sort of thing is developed, then it's extremely tightly controlled and it doesn't diffuse out to people. And there has been some degree of success with this when it comes to nuclear proliferation. There were a lot of nations that perhaps could have gone into the nuclear club with their level of scientific understanding and natural resources who haven't. But again, when you have more actors, it becomes a much more difficult situation to regulate.
One of the new technologies coming through is nuclear fusion, though, which I know is still a concept, is still in development. But I think, if I'm right now, we have allowed fusion at very, very high temperatures to produce slightly more electricity than it costs to produce that. How how far away from things like cold fusion are we? And the reason I ask this is that newscientist.com released some data this year. Now, argue the data if you want, but they said that training a single AI can have a carbon footprint that's 5 times higher than the lifetime emissions of an average car. So AI does have its own carbon footprint. We're going to need new technologies that are going to be downstream of things like electric vehicles and so on, so that we don't just power clean cars with dirty fuels. How much is coming through around fusion, or is this just still science fiction and an idea really at the moment?
Okay, well, I am glad that you asked me this because my podcast, which I'll plug briefly, is Physical Attraction, has done some 27 episodes on a comprehensive history of nuclear fusion over the last year or so, which I've really enjoyed researching and learning more about. Particularly because for a long time it has occupied this place in people's psyche that is, once we crack fusion, we'll have clean energy. You see people say clean energy, you see people say cheap energy, you see people say limitless energy in some cases. It's not clean, it's not cheap, and it's not limitless, which is what I would say about fusion. All of those things are true for various different reasons. It's not clean because even though you don't... So in the difference, we should say first, in traditional nuclear power plants, fission, you have heavy isotopes like uranium, which split apart and release energy. In fusion, you have light isotopes like hydrogen and deuterium, which are pushed together, and when they fuse, they also release energy. So you can see actually that the difference here, and the reason why one of them has been an established technology since the 50s, and the other one might not arrive until the 2050s, is because of this process of pushing the nuclei together. Now, the sun manages to achieve this. All solar power is ultimately fusion power. But the sun has an advantage, which is that the sun weighs 2 times 10 to the 30 kilograms. It's very heavy, has a lot of gravitational pressure, which it can rely on to force this fusion to happen in the heart of the sun. The people who are trying to make fusion happen on Earth are doing so at temperatures that are hotter than the heart of the sun, because they don't have that sort of gravitational pressure to rely on. And to overcome this immense electrical repulsion between these nuclei, to force them together so that they get close enough to fuse, it requires an amazing amount of energy, which is why you need to have them at such high temperatures so that these nuclei are whizzing around fast enough such that they might actually collide and fuse together. And of course, to do this, you also have to contain them somehow. At least this is one branch of fusion that relies on you containing these nuclei in magnetic fields. So since the 1950s, people have been trying various different ways of doing this with varying degrees of success. You said that you think that there is a procedure where they've released more electricity than has been required to power a nuclear power plant. I don't think that's true. The record so far in tokamaks, which are these magnetic confinement fusion devices that I described, was about 2/3 of the electricity that was put into, the heat energy that was put into the plasma was converted into heat energy in the fused plasma. So there's a few things to say about that record. One is that 2/3 is good, yes, but the actual requirement for the sort of building to be powered and the various other things that go into keeping this going means that the actual figure is sort of slightly less than 2/3. Another thing to say is that you have the heat energy that's been supplied to the plasma, which is then converted into heat when this fusion happens. That's good, but the heat itself is not electricity, so you need to find some way of converting that heat into useful electricity. In the case of a fossil fuel power plant where we just burn things, fossil fuels, and convert that heat into electricity by boiling water to generate steam, which spins a turbine, the efficiency is typically around 30%. So there's a factor of 3, even if you can harness the heat from fusion straight into electricity. But we don't necessarily know that we can do this because the heat is released in the form of these very fast-moving neutrons. These fast-moving neutrons are the reason why fusion power is not necessarily clean either, because when they hit things, the things that they hit become radioactive, which means that you imagine all of this plasma that's going around inside a big metal tube a donut that they call the tokamak, and it's held in place by these magnetic fields. When it fuses together, these neutrons are released, and they gradually make the walls of the reactor radioactive. So every few years, you will have to replace the walls of the reactor, and that will be nuclear waste. It's not as dangerous as the nuclear waste you get from fission, but you still don't want to put it anywhere near people, so you'll have to find a way of burying that as well. So it doesn't necessarily produce no waste whatsoever. And in addition to that, it's not limitless, because although deuterium, which is the sort of fuel for fusion, can potentially be found in seawater, the fusion reactions that we're working on at the moment are the ones with the lowest energy barrier, which are deuterium-tritium reactions. Now, tritium is an isotope of hydrogen. It's very rare. It has a very short half-life, which means it decays quickly, which means there's not much of it to be found on Earth. In fact, one of the only ways that people think you could develop a fusion reactor at the moment would be to have it produce its own fuel. So these fast neutrons that I talked about would be hitting a wall made of lithium. When they hit the wall made of lithium, they would produce more tritium, and you'd have to scavenge that from the inside of the reactor, so the reactor is kind of self-sustaining and producing its own fuel. But this is one of the things that no one necessarily knows if it can actually be done yet. It depends on how good you are at retrieving the tritium from the reactor itself. So when it comes to mainstream fusion efforts of this kind, there's the ITER tokamak, which is the one that's being built in the south of France at the moment. It should go online for the first sort of plasma experiments in the 2020s, and maybe it will start developing proper sort of... It will go for its own electricity record. So I mentioned this 2/3 electricity record. That was set in 1997 by the Joint European Torus in Oxfordshire, near me. And it's going to take until 2030 for the next generation device, ITER, to have a shot at that target. And it's the fact that these fusion reactors are so complicated to build, so expensive, and so difficult to create that I think is really the reason why fusion... There's an old joke about fusion energy that it's 10 years away and always will be. And that's because these devices are so difficult to iterate. It's so hard to build a new one. It takes such an awfully long time. There's so many potential problems that can happen along the way, which is why, you'll have a record that's been set since 1997 and hasn't been broken yet. You won't see that kind of thing in solar power, for example, which is developing much more quickly, or the prices for wind power, which are also developing much more quickly. Which is why I think if you're an investor, you should probably put your money into one of those two rather than fusion necessarily. Now, you mentioned... So it's not all doom and gloom for fusion, because while the ITER device reckons it will produce net electricity by 2040, say, and then maybe there will be power plants based on that device in the 2050s and 2060s, 2070s. That's the sort of timescale that they're looking at in mainstream fusion. So when it comes to, you were talking about the carbon emissions from AI and the carbon emissions all over the planet, really, I think in some ways, if you're developing a new source of power that only comes online in 2050, it's too late. We want the UK to be carbon neutral by then. If we want to stick to the 2 degrees goal of Paris, we really want the world to be carbon neutral by 2050. So if your source of carbon-free electricity only just starts working in 2050, then it's not really relevant to talk about fusion as a solution to climate change. As our Prime Minister here in the UK recently did. I think he's misguided to suggest that. Even he was saying that we might get it by 2040, but even then, you would need to scale it up. And if each plant takes you 10 years to build, then it's obvious that you're not going to decarbonize your electricity system by 2050 in that way. It's just too slow compared to the alternatives that we have available at the moment. But there are other ways that people are trying to do this. There's some startup companies at the moment. There's one that's spun out of MIT called Commonwealth Fusion Systems. What they're trying to do is build a tokamak very similar to the ITER device, but much smaller, which means it will be faster to build. And the reason they can build one smaller is because they're going to use high-temperature superconducting magnets which have a stronger magnetic field. So basically, the stronger the magnetic field is, the smaller you can build the device. And they hope to have theirs producing power by 2030. Now, the issue there is this material science question of building these high-temperature superconductors that can stand up to the punishing conditions inside a fusion reactor, and no one knows if that will happen. But if that sort of thing is successful, then we might see it in the course of a decade or two. But there's a few caveats to point out here. So one is that you mentioned cold fusion. That cold fusion is not going to happen. Simply put, it was there was a lot of hype around it in the late 1980s because of an experiment by these guys, Fleischmann and Pons. There's an episode about it in the show. Basically, what they thought they measured, wasn't actual fusion. They weren't really producing electricity. It all came down to measurement errors. And people have, for an awfully long time after that, tried to continue doing the Fleischmann-Pons experiment to see if they can find anything. There was even a recent effort that was funded in part by Google and carried out all over different universities. They got a paper in Nature about it. But their conclusion was that cold fusion just doesn't work. And it's simple to see why, because, frankly, there's no way around this massive energy barrier that you have to push these nuclei closer together. If you don't heat your nuclei up to these incredibly high temperatures or find some other way of giving them that energy, then there's simply no way to get them to fuse and release power. And the second thing I would say about nuclear fusion, now that we've said that mainstream fusion maybe 2050s, 2060s if they're successful, startup fusion maybe 2040s, 2050s if they're successful, is this idea that it can save us from climate change once it's developed. And I think the issue there is one of finance. I mean, really, in some ways, it seems kind of obvious to say it. If I go into Dragon's Den and I have two businessmen who are trying to talk to me, and they're saying they have different ways of producing energy, and one of them says, I will create hotter matter than exists anywhere else in the universe. I will confine it with magnetic fields. I will prevent it from exploding outwards like it often does in the course of these experiments that we've done so far in things called disruptions and damaging the walls of the tank. I will contain it for longer than it's ever been contained anywhere else in the world. At the moment, these things are contained for, on the order of, I think the record is 5 minutes, but it wasn't producing the maximum power then. There's always a trade-off with these things. But I will contain it for longer than anyone else has ever contained it. I will find a way to harness these hot neutrons into electricity, and then I will use those hot neutrons to generate steam, spin a turbine, and make electricity. And if you fund me, I will need $50 billion or $10 billion or $1 billion or whatever. It will take you 10, 20 years to build something on that scale, and I can start generating profit for you in the course of 20 or 30 years. So that's one investor. And the other investor says, what we're trying to do here is spin a turbine to generate electricity. Windmills, I'll just build one of those, but a bit bigger. I can have it built in 6 months. You can pay me a few $1 million up front and I'll start realizing profit for you by the end of the year. I mean, it's just obvious which one you finance. And so I think if I had an opinion on this, I think it's ultimately going to be that maybe scientists will crack fusion, but even if they do, it will probably be one of the more expensive ways of generating power. And it's difficult to see how those costs can come down because those costs are things that are fundamental to the way that we do fusion. You have to build a big reactor. You have to have the huge magnets. You have to find some way of producing your own fuel. All of these things that cost so much, they're just not going to be innovated away. And all the time while fusion is trying to work, the prices of wind and solar and storage that you'll need to solve this intermittency issue are falling all the time. It will take you a few weeks, a few months in the lab to come up with a new solar cell design, a new battery design. You can model the wind turbines very quickly and come up with new designs for them. To test a new fusion reactor, it will take you 10 years to build it. I mean, they're as simple as that. This is the reason why fission power, for example, even though it's been going since the 1950s, there's been very slow development on the pace of that, and it's getting more expensive over time rather than less expensive. One of the reasons is that it's very difficult to put these same forces of innovation to work on that as you can with renewables. So fusion is really interesting science. It's really fascinating stuff. I think when it's achieved, which hopefully will be within my lifetime, it will be the culmination of an incredible effort on behalf of thousands of very, very smart people. But I don't think it's the solution to our energy problem.
The scenario you presented with the investors makes some assumptions. And if we took a third investor who had no problem whatsoever with timeline, had incredibly large budgets and a high propensity for risk, including taking on some big bets, we might see different outcomes. Thomas, what's China up to on the moon?
China on the moon. I didn't know China was on the moon.
Oh, China's on the moon. There's a headline from epochtimes.com, the epochtimes.com, 4 days ago. China plans to exploit $10 trillion Earth-Moon economic zone. There are minerals, materials, chemicals, etc. on the moon that they think are worth a lot of money. They're up there, they're landing rovers up there, and they plan to start mining the moon, from what I can understand. One of the things they're looking at is helium-3, which, according to this article, and I welcome your pushback on it, could be used as a fuel source. And they mention nuclear fusion here, although you may already have debunked that. And they're looking at hydrogen, helium, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen as others. So I would argue that your third investor there is China. And they're not looking, well, they are looking at wind turbines, but they're not looking at short-term investments that make 10 or 50% returns. They're looking at controlling a big stake of our future. And that's one of the reasons that we see them on the moon. Do you take into account countries like China and what their intentions might be when you think about the development rate of things like this?
Well, it's certainly true that China has an active nuclear fusion program, but one thing I would say straight away is this idea that helium-3 will be the fuel for fusion. So, as I mentioned before, there's lots of different types of fusion reactions you can get. The ones that we're looking at the moment are the ones with the lowest energy barrier, which is deuterium-tritium. The helium reactions are at a much, much higher energy barrier, which means that they are much, much more difficult in themselves to realize. So all of the problems that we've had so far getting deuterium tritium to work are multiplied by a factor of 1,000, 10,000 when it comes to getting these other reactions to work. I know that China is interested in fusion and they've got their own devices going, and because they're quite secretive, who knows, maybe that could push our timescale forward from 2040 to 2030 if we're lucky. But I think the issues surrounding fusion will still be that it will still be more expensive. I mean, I know you've said that there's an investor with deep pockets who are willing to spend lots and lots of things on developing fusion, but if it's still the most expensive way, even the people who assume that it works and assume all of the best parameters that we can foresee at the moment will be realized, say that by the time it's developed in the 2050s, it will be the most expensive way of generating electricity. And I just don't see how it can reduce its cost. When you think about the material complexity of building a fusion reactor compared to building a solar panel, in the future, we're going to have solar panels that can basically just be painted onto things. They're already developing these materials at the moment, perovskites and things like this. And ultimately, yeah, I think there's all sorts of interesting things to do with space exploration that people are very excited about, and getting resources from the moon and all this kind of thing. I think in the near term, we're not going to see it. In the long term, it might have some uses. And that's where I think a lot of fusion advocates really see this going, as being used in the much, much further future term. But ultimately, there are physical constraints on some of these things. It's a bit like so there's a lot of talk in the climate change community about negative emissions technologies, pulling carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, which is all very well and good, but you have to remember that the industry that is putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at the moment is huge in scale. It's the scale of all industry. Every car is doing this. Every fossil fuel power plant is doing this. You can't be incredibly clever and get around the laws of physics, because the laws of physics set fundamental constraints on what you can do. So it doesn't matter how much money you spend, how much technological innovation you do, you will be limited in terms of the efficiency of things that you can develop always. I mean, this is true. I said that the average fossil fuel power plant is 30% efficient. That's not because people are rubbish at innovating. It's because there are fundamental limits to how much you can do. Obviously, if you could change that 30% to 35%, then you're making millions of dollars for someone. So there's an awfully large drive to try and get that kind of thing done. But it just turns out to be very difficult to do. And I think ultimately these constraints will mean that fusion will probably always be more expensive in most circumstances than the renewable alternative. because I said if it goes well, it will be the most expensive form of electricity by 2040, 2050. That's in terms of today's prices. So that would assume that this exponential decline in wind, solar, and storage that we've seen just stops, and we have no reason to assume that. So I, I, I'm interested always in what people are doing in terms of fusion. I think it's a really fascinating area of science, and I hope that we can put lots of funding into it and get it realized faster than people are currently envisioning. But even when it's done, I think there are these fundamental limits that will mean it can only ever form a part, and perhaps a small part of the overall solution. But it's interesting when it comes to getting resources from the moon. I think it's a very interesting idea. You just have to wonder how much of it is being done for sort of political reasons, as if to say, I mean, when you talk about China and the US are really now the two superpowers that are sort of vying for things. When we put humans on the moon in the 1960s, you might have immediately thought, of course, this means that we'll soon be colonizing the moon and we'll soon be colonizing different planets, we'll soon be doing all sorts of things. But this was done for political reasons, really, rather than out of any expectation that it would lead to profit. And I wonder how much of this sort of talk of exploiting lunar resources and so on at the moment is really more to do with that and more to do with a sort of techno-optimistic futurism than actually solid sort of business plans that will lead to profit or benefits later on. Of course, if it is a case of superpower competition, then it would make sense to want to be the first one to establish a mining operation on the moon, for example, even if it's an incredibly loss-making mining operation that's not actually getting you any resources that you really need, because at least you can then say that you were the first ones there. And if the price does come down and it does become viable to do, then you have a sort of, I don't know, you have the toehold in that established for later on.
Yes. And national pride. I think I remember national pride. It's been a while.
Well, certainly that's what drove the space race for sure.
From a US
moon
perspective,
bases were coming any soon.
Absolutely, it made a wonderful statement for the US, but I just meant here in the UK.
Oh yeah, well,
national pride is not high on our list of enjoyable activities at the moment. But you made me think of Google there actually, and the Google Corporation, of course, is called Alphabet, but it's not Alphabet, it's Alphabet. And the whole point of the organization was to make these alpha bets, these big bets on things like AI and other technologies, so that they could have a portion of their business and their revenues and so on that would be looking at the big goals, just like we're talking about there with China. I want to ask you a few bonus questions now, Thomas, if you don't mind.
Of course.
The first one is, what view or belief do you hold that you would consider to be uncommon?
Well, I hate to do one that I've already sort of talked about a little bit, but the best answer I can think to this really is this fusion question, because a lot of people who are skeptical of nuclear fusion think that it won't be achieved. They think that it won't happen because people said in the 50s that we'll have it in 20 years. People said in the 70s that we'll have it in 20 years. People said in the 90s we'd have it in 20 years, etc., etc. They see no reason why there won't be further delay. I think that it will happen. I think that we will see net electricity being generated by fusion by 2050. That's not the reason for my skepticism. My skepticism is just that once we've actually finally achieved that symbolic goal of generating net electricity from fusion, people will realize that it's the most expensive way of generating electricity you can possibly imagine. And I think at that point, funding for it will dry up. And that will be why we won't see nuclear fusion on the grid anytime soon. So it's a sort of, I guess it's kind of qualified skepticism. And although I'm not a huge fan of the man, I did note that Elon Musk actually feels the same way. He said that we have the fusion reactor we need, and that's the sun.
What is humanity's greatest challenge?
So what sort of timescale are we talking about?
You can choose from one of three, now, in your lifetime, or ever.
Okay. I think right now, climate change is hard to look past. We have seen 20, 30 years of warnings about climate change, increasingly vociferous. We've seen impacts getting worse all around us. We've seen in 2015 an international agreement to limit climate change and to reduce carbon emissions. And carbon emissions have risen every single year, with the one exception being 2009 when we had a global financial crisis. So not only is the problem getting worse because the problem depends on the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide you've emitted and the amount that's in the atmosphere, but the rate at which we're making the problem get worse is getting worse. So in many ways, we're deeply in debt and we're just getting more and more credit cards out at the moment. Now, there are really good signs that make me more optimistic about this challenge, but I think it hits so many issues with the way our societies are organized at the moment. It's very difficult to see how anything other than extremely cheap green energy and extremely cheap energy efficiency techniques, things like insulating homes and so on, that have to be done to get this to work, and extremely cheap batteries for electric vehicles and so on. If we continue to live in a world that is dominated, as our world is, by market forces, then this problem is never going to be solved. Unless the alternatives, the green alternatives, become cheaper than the polluting alternatives that we have at the moment. Because most attempts to regulate these things have had difficult effects that weren't necessarily the ones that were intended. One of my favorite examples of an unintended consequence from regulation is the US put a mandate on fuels. They said, okay, 10% of all of our fuels will come from biofuels, because they thought that biofuels were a greener source of fuel. And it's true, they are. Theoretically, with a biofuel, you grow the crop, you convert it into fuel, you burn the fuel. The fuel emits carbon dioxide when you burn it, but it took it in when it was growing as a crop, and so the whole process is carbon neutral. So this idea that you have this bioethanol mandate in the US, 10% of their fuels would be made of bioethanol, sounds good on paper. What happened in practice was all of the big corn farmers in the US, who are a very powerful lobby there, they're very good at getting their political views put across. They started converting their corn into bioethanol. Now, corn is not a great biofuel. It just happened that the Americans had a lot of corn because everyone there grew corn. So consequently, we have the situation where a third of US corn production goes to creating about half of their biofuel. So we have a third of US corn production, which is their biggest crop, is converted to a tiny fraction of the fuels that are being used in the US. And what are these fuels being used on? They're being used on massive gas-guzzling SUVs. I mean, SUVs were the second biggest cause of increased emissions from 2010 to 2018. Those extra credit cards that we're still taking out, more of that was spent on SUVs than even agriculture in other countries. The only thing bigger than that was more fossil fuel power generation across the world. But SUVs are what we're basically spending our additional debt on. And so a policy intervention, which sounded great, make sure that everyone puts biofuel in their cars and people will find cheap ways of developing biofuel, ended up creating this massive perverse incentive, which has meant we're converting food stocks that could be used to feed people into a tiny, tiny fraction of the emissions reductions that are required in a very, very inefficient way that probably, when you assess it overall, is not really doing anything to dent carbon emissions. And it just goes to show how difficult it can be to intervene on this system, and I think why a lot of interventions that have happened so far have basically not really contributed anything to the slowing down of the increase of fossil fuels. So I think in the short term, climate change, and also this idea of these disruptive technologies and how we're going to govern them, and I don't want to be sort of Pollyanna-ish about it or anything, but I think if these disruptive technologies that we're worried about happening do arise, we're not ready for them now. We are not ready for them now, and they could cause a lot of devastation before we really have a chance to react.
Can you give an example?
Well, I mean, so one of the things that interested me when I was researching the series that we had, which was called Teotwalki, which was about all these sort of speculative end of the world scenarios, was have you ever wondered why bird flu and swine flu were considered such big threats, whereas the normal strains of flu we weren't as worried about them? The reason is that when a disease crosses from an animal into a human, it's not really calibrated for humans. Because the ideal thing for a flu to do is to make you cough and sneeze and spread the flu to other people as much as you can, but not kill you. Because if it kills you, then you're not hosting the flu anymore. So it's bad for the flu virus if it kills its host. So all of the natural diseases that we live with have, most of them, not really evolved to kill us, if that makes sense. They've evolved to transmit to as many other hosts as they possibly can before killing us, if they do kill us. And if they kill us, it's probably in the process of getting us to be good vectors for the disease, if that makes sense. So you can imagine now a bioengineered pandemic. This could be really, really subtly done in such a way that you wouldn't have any of the issues that these diseases have where they're trying not to kill the host. You could imagine some sort of horrendous disease that might spread like flu and just have flu-like symptoms for the first 14 days, the first 30 days, and then immediately start attacking all of the organs and killing the person. I mean, this is a weapon of mass destruction. And I'm not a biologist, I have to say, I'm a physicist, but I don't know that there's really that much stopping someone from developing this kind of weapon in the next 5-10 years. And then if they did something like that, then I just don't see us being able to respond to it. And of course, maybe you imagine a sort of flu pandemic like the Spanish flu after the First World War, which was one of these strains of flu that happened to be unusually deadly and did kill a lot of its hosts. That killed more people than the First World War. If we have an event like that nowadays, not only would it kill 10 times more people again, perhaps, but just imagine what it would do to our global society. Just imagine how governments would change and react. I think there's all sorts of terrifying things that you can dream about that may soon be in the hands of a larger number of people than we would like. Not all people that we necessarily trust. And if that happens, and we haven't, regulated it properly in advance, then the sort of the first attack could already be the largest one, if you see what I mean. So that's the kind of thing, I think, alongside our sort of failure to deal with climate change that keeps me up at night.
Overcoming climate change clearly is very important for us, but what else would you say constitutes success for humanity?
Well, this is very interesting. So we went back, we were talking a long time ago about the general artificial intelligence and this idea of what would you program it to do if you could. And we had this utilitarianism, obviously, and it's this idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And it comes down to how you define good and what we want out of the world. You could imagine a world where we use these new technologies to engineer ourselves into being happy. There's no reason to think that that would necessarily be impossible if you had sufficiently advanced technology. But is it a desirable world? I think for reasons that we'd find very difficult to explain, we'd find that quite philosophically unsatisfying. So I think what constitutes success for humanity is eradicating the injustices that exist in the world at the moment. I'm talking about global inequality, which there's a very interesting book that I recommend everyone read called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. And he goes through, he's an anthropologist, he goes through civilizations throughout history. And he finds civilizations from, tribes, medieval Europe, all sorts of different parts of the world, all sorts of different regions of history. And he uses historical reconstructions to figure out how unequal the societies were. And what it turns out is that humanity in all these different societies are locked in a cycle. Inequality increases steadily most of the time. And then some disaster happens and inequality goes back down to zero, or it goes back down to a lower value. A classic example that you hear a lot in history textbooks is the Black Death, which here in Britain, completely ravaged the country, killed, I don't know how many people, but a very large proportion a significant proportion of the people who were agricultural labourers and so on at the time. And this actually reduced inequality because the few farmers who were left alive, the few wage labourers who were left alive, could charge more for their services because there were fewer people competing with them. If you have more to lose, then a catastrophe damages you more than anyone else. Say it's the Blitz and 2 homes are destroyed. One of them's a massive mansion and the other one is a 2 up, 2 down small house, terraced house. One person has lost more wealth than the other, and therefore inequality has been reduced. And it turns out that these disasters, mass mobilization warfare is an example, natural disasters are an example that Scheidel points to again and again, pandemics and things like this. These are the things that reduce inequality historically throughout civilization. Revolutions are, of course, another great example. Inequality did go down briefly in 1917 in Russia, which is the kind of thing you can do if you're willing to execute all the aristocrats. I think so. Success for humanity and a society at the moment, I think, would be finding a way to break this cycle so that we can reduce inequality, so that we can share the benefits of our new technology and our new systems of doing things with as many people as possible without some sort of violent disruption, some sort of horrible catastrophe that actually shocks us into making the world a more equal place. I think that's short-term success. And long-term success is all that fancy stuff about, colonizing the universe and having billions of people living billions of happy lives, anything like that. It's difficult to look too far beyond what exists at the moment because I think our understanding of what success is would change over time, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, yes. And that stat you're looking for is bbc.co.uk, quote, 30 to 45% of the population in the UK was killed by Black Death between 1348 and 1350. So you were absolutely accurate about the devastation there. What is the best possible outcome for this relationship between humans and intelligent machines?
This is where, so I've said before that I'm not that worried about artificial intelligence, general intelligence as a sort of short-term problem. But when you pose that question, which I think is a fascinating question, what is the best possible relationship between humans and intelligent machines? It's really difficult because if you take this, and you may disagree, people listening may disagree, I may disagree in my more pessimistic moments, but if you take this notion that we can actually invent an intelligence that is on the scale of human intelligence seriously, or something even far, far more intelligent than humanity seriously, then envisioning what a good version of that relationship might look like is an extremely difficult thing to do because we can't conceive of how we'll relate to these things. It's much, much easier to imagine the dystopias. People think about worlds where we'd have AI that are basically slaves doing tasks for us. Or even, you see, the interesting concept, if you're actually able to program another mind sufficiently well, is that you could create a slave that would be happy to be a slave. You could create an algorithm, a mind, that would be satisfied and find pleasure in doing whatever you told it to, whether that's accountancy or actuarial work or digging ditches, whatever you like. I mean, if that is a positive realization of our relationship with intelligent machines, I don't know. You could say that it has benefits for both parties. We have humans that have all our work being done for us by intelligent machines, and intelligent machines that are perfectly happy to do it. Somehow it seems like it's a little bit unfair from our tendency to anthropomorphize these machines that this should be the way that it would work. I mean, one utopian fantasy that always kind of got me when I read it as a kid is there's this book, Blood Music, by an author called Greg Bear. And he hypothesized about a world where basically AI would take the form of these nano-robots. And these nano-robots split and developed out of all control. They became super intelligent and they took over the world. And they appeared to wipe out the human race. So throughout this, our protagonists are trying to avoid these nanorobots and they're trying to escape from what they're about to do and they're sort of running away from them and trying to stay alive. But eventually they're subsumed by this goop of the nanorobots and you think, oh, our protagonists are dead. But then you're looking at the book and you see there's 50 pages left and you realize that what they've done, these intelligent machines, is sort of subsume the human race into a sort of heavenly simulation where they're capable of talking to all of their loved ones, all of their consciousnesses are preserved, they're capable of wandering around in, beautiful landscapes, beautiful settings, visiting all of the different places that exist in the world. There's no sort of need for disharmony or disquiet. Everyone is sort of enjoying this incredibly abundant, incredibly rich, heaven-like lifestyle. The reason that I thought this was so interesting is because then you almost get into the perception of, well, if we did sort of liberate this power, is this really what we want? What do we want? I'm not sure we know. So I think when it comes to talking about a good relationship between humans and intelligent machines, it's almost unfathomable the range of different ways that this could unfold. There's some nice scenarios where we sort of treat each other as equals, or we allow the AI to go off and do its own thing, or the AI creates a nice world for us to live in, or alternatively, we create a nice world for it to live in. But it's almost so ill-defined as to be very difficult to comprehend what any of this might look like. But I think the reason that I'm happy there's philosophers like Stuart Armstrong who are working on this thing is I think if you think this problem has to be solved in the next 50 years, you better start now because it's a really complicated problem, imagining a future where we can coexist in a positive way alongside another intelligent, perhaps far more intelligent than us, entity, if that makes sense.
It does, and a wonderful question that you put out there as well. The simple but brilliant, what do we want? And if we can cure disease and get rid of the postcode lottery and solve the inequality issues and give every single person on this planet an opportunity to enjoy a wondrous life in which destruction and livestock and so on weren't part of the equation, then asking that question again now, what do we want? Just makes the mind boggle. What what do you think humanity once knew, but now we have forgotten?
It's interesting. I think this is difficult to talk about, but I did hear an interesting interview recently with the documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis, who I'm sure some of the people listening will have seen things of. And actually, I didn't think much of him during the interview. There were a lot of things he talked about, especially in terms of climate change, that I thought he was fairly ill-informed on. But one of the things that he was very good at talking about was this idea that society has changed in a way that has made it more individualistic. So this is not necessarily true of the whole of humanity. I think I'm just focusing on the people in the West and the people that I know, really, um, and the sort of culture that we see around us. And it's this idea that we have become extremely individualistic, extremely motivated by our own self-image and our own desires and our own hierarchy of needs, so to speak, such that everyone is fixated on their own success and their own career, their own uh, place within history, in a sense. And to do this, we've lost a sense of the collective, according to Adam Curtis. And I think he does have a point here. We've lost the sense of giving yourself up and giving yourself to other people and the well-being of the community, because to do such a thing is no longer a necessity to survive. There's a thing in psychology that I think is called Dunbar's number, which is this idea that you can only really maintain relationships with a few hundred people at once, because this was the size of a tribal community that would tend to form. And once upon a time, it was necessary for you to be part of such a community, really, in order to survive. And there was, I think, more of a collective action. People did more things for the sake of the collective group that they were part of. And I think now technology and the organization of society has enabled people to be more selfish, perhaps more individualistic. And I wonder if instead of this, so if you follow my arguments about disruptive technologies arising and having to be regulated, instead of organizations trying to regulate the behavior of the individual, if we had a more collective approach to problems, if we viewed ourselves more coherently as a group, then there might possibly be less of a temptation to create and deploy such destructive technologies. So I think this could be something we've forgotten that we once knew. But of course, the issue now is we're no longer limited to these communities of 300, 400, 500 people. You or I can look at the news and we can see what's happening to any of the billions of people all around the world, people who we never would have met under normal circumstances, people in a population the size of which the world has never known. And I think that sense of belonging to a larger whole, and that whole being humanity. In some ways, it's something we once knew but we've forgotten, and in some ways, it's something that I think we never knew but we need to learn.
I've got a special bonus question for you, Thomas.
Okay, go ahead.
What's your beef with Elon Musk?
Okay, well, my beef with Elon Musk is, I suppose it's not a massive beef, but I think in some ways it's a little bit like some films that I'm not a huge fan of, where the fan base of the film is more irritating than the film itself. And so Elon Musk has made some decisions that aren't great. He's done some things with his company that aren't necessarily well advised. One example would be the time he basically tried to inflate his own share price by saying he was taking Tesla private. He's insulted people on Twitter. He's pursued sort of weird personal vendettas against individual people. And he's made some sort of claims about technology that can perhaps be seen as a bit misleading. This isn't to say that the bad things that he's done have outweighed the good, but I think the issue is that if you ever find yourself attacking him, an army of defenders immediately come to his sort of rescue, saying, well, what has anyone but Elon Musk ever done to advance technology or so on? In general, I think it's really a Silicon Valley problem that we have at the moment, but there's sort of too much of a focus on the maverick individual CEO and their potential to change things. And I think if you know the story of Theranos, the blood testing company that didn't really have any working technology whatsoever, a lot of that was driven by this sort of worship of the CEO. And I think Elon Musk, although Tesla is a great company and what he's doing with batteries and solar cells is amazing, and I'm a big fan of that, I think you can't identify any one person with these industries and this tendency. And where his decisions and his decision-making process conflict with the goals that we all have for this kind of technology, we shouldn't be afraid to say so. There's no harm in that, I don't think. So I'm reluctant to describe myself as his fan for that reason, because I think we should be fans of, I mean, if the last few years, at least in terms of looking at people, have taught us anything, it's that hero worship is often a dangerous game, isn't it? People have flaws, we should acknowledge that, and we should be fans of ideals and maybe technologies rather than necessarily individuals.
Seth Godin says that power doesn't corrupt, power reveals, and absolute power, therefore, absolutely reveals. And it sounds like you're referring to some of that with Elon Musk. Thomas, thank you graciously so much for your time today.
You're very, very welcome. It's been great talking to you, and thanks for providing me with so many interesting questions.